Today I am going to teach you about research methods in community psychology, both the qualitative ones and the quantitative ones. Once I finish my module, you will be able to identify the characteristics of qualitative research in community psychology, the strengths and limitations of it. You will also identify the characteristics of quantitative research and also the strengths and weaknesses of quantitative research. Let me introduce to you the topic. The study of psychology tends to be diverse and draws out knowledge from other fields so as to completely understand the psychological phenomena. Psychologists may carry out basic research to further understand a particular area of interest in psychology, or they may even conduct applied research to solve problems in the clinic, workplace, and other areas. In terms of methodology, research in community psychology can be divided into two categories, the qualitative and the quantitative. Let me begin with the qualitative research. Research that investigates aspects of social life which are not amenable to quantitative measurement. Associated with a variety of theoretical perspectives, qualitative research uses a range of methods to focus on the meanings and interpretation of social phenomena and social processes in the particular context in which they occur. The methods used in qualitative research, often in combination, are those which are open-ended and which allow the collection of detailed information in a relatively closed settings. These methods include depth interviewing, ethnography, participant observation, case studies, etc. The common features of qualitative methods are that the qualitative approaches are useful for examining situations, processes, and contexts that have not been studied in detail. They give voice to perspectives that have not been fully articulated in existing research. Thus, community researchers use qualitative approaches in initial exploration and theory development stages of a project, generating hypotheses that can be later tested in quantitative research. But qualitative approaches also stand on their own, providing detailed analysis of complex, dynamic, and meaningful live experiences across a variety of social and cultural contexts. Now I am going to talk to you about the common features of qualitative research. The first feature is contextual meaning. The principal aim of qualitative research is to understand the meaning of a phenomenon for persons who experience it in the context of their lives. This involves allowing persons to speak in their own voices as much as possible, although interpretation by researchers is also involved. Number 2. Participant-researcher collaboration. Contextual meaning is created within personal, mutual relationships that evolve over time between the research participants and the researchers. Third is purposeful sampling. The researcher develops a richly layered understanding of a particular community, group, or setting. The sample of persons included in the research is usually small to facilitate the level of detail needed. Fourthly, listening. As much as possible, the researcher sets aside preconceptions and attempts to understand the person or setting on their own terms, in their language and context. Attentiveness, asking open-ended questions, and providing freedom for interventions to structure their own responses are preferred over standardized questionnaires. There is also reflexivity. Reflexivity is researchers seek to be reflexive, stating their interests, values, preconceptions, and personal statuses or roles as explicitly as possible, both to the person studied and in the research report. Fifth is the thick description. Qualitative data in psychology are usually in form of words. The researcher seeks specific thick descriptions of personal experiences, detailed enough to provide convincing evidence of realism. Sixthly, data analysis and interpretation. The processes of data collection, data analysis, and interpretation overlap, and the researcher moves back and forth among them. Analysis often consists of identifying, repeating themes or separating and comparing distinct categories or stages. Next is checking. Usually, after several rounds of refinement through data collection and analysis, the researcher may check themes and interpretations by presenting them to the informants or other community members for correction, clarifications, and interpretations. Eighth point is multiple interpretations. It is possible to have multiple interpretations or accounts of a topic. However, an account should be internally consistent and compelling in terms of its realism and thick description. Lastly is generalization. Generalization of findings is less important than understanding meaning among the persons sampled. Researchers may generalize findings by identifying the converging themes from multiple studies or cases. If I talk about the acts of qualitative research, how do qualitative researchers conduct a study? There are basically 4 acts, just like the acts played out in a drama: asking, witnessing, interpreting, and knowing. Moving on to the qualitative research methods. So while we now discuss the 4 different types of qualitative methods, which are participant observation, qualitative interviews, focus groups, and case studies. Let's begin with the first one, which is the participant observation. Many community researchers, especially if they conduct participatory research, perform at least some participant observation. It is a key component of ethnographic research in anthropology and other social sciences. The strengths and limitations of this method. Participant observation is the method of choice for a researcher seeking maximum insider knowledge and depth of experience in a community. The participant observer knows the setting thoroughly and can communicate its essence vividly. This method also maximizes the researcher-community relationship and affords thick description of many aspects of community life. However, that depth of knowledge comes at a price. First, the focus on one setting necessarily means that generalizability to other settings is going to be a problem. This can be reduced by visiting other settings, usually in less depth but long enough to discern the applicability of one's findings. A second issue concerns whether the researcher experiences and records are representative of the setting and its dynamics. Moving on to the second method, which is the qualitative interviewing. Interviewing a sample of individuals has become a popular qualitative research format in community psychology. The interview is often open-ended or minimally structured to promote participants describing experiences in their own words. Samples are small to facilitate interviewing and analysis in depth. The strengths and weaknesses of this method. Qualitative interviewing allows flexible exploration of the phenomenon of interest and discovery of aspects not anticipated by the researcher. It is based in a strong relationship between the researcher and the participants. It involves attending to the voices of the participants and thick descriptions of their experiences. It can challenge the researcher's preconceptions and affords contextual understanding of the community, culture, or population. Interviewing has several advantages over participant observation. Data collection can be more standardized, limiting biases of selective perception, memory, and interpretation. Interviews can be recorded and transcripts prepared, so analysis can be based on the participants' actual words. Analysis can also be standardized and performed by multiple independent raters, not just the interviewer, which again increases the reliability and validity. The next method is that of focus groups. A focus group discussion is an interview with a group. It generates thick description, qualitative information in response to questions or discussions, topics posed by the moderator. Now, using focus groups, researchers can assess similarities and differences among individuals and allow participants to elaborate upon ideas and themes by reacting to each other, not just by the interviewer. In a focus group research, the group, not the individual, is the unit of analysis. Moving on to its strengths and weaknesses. These are similar to qualitative interviewing. However, focus groups have several advantages over other qualitative methods. Researchers can structure discussions and learn about topics of interest and personal experiences of others more easily than with participant observation. Compared to individual interviews, focus groups allows greater access to shared knowledge and mutual discussion. They also allow researchers to observe social interactions among group participants, perhaps revealing behavioral patterns unavailable in individual interviews. However, a focus group moderator has less flexibility to ask for elaborations, control changes of topic, or learn about individuals in depth than an interviewer does during individual interview. Focus groups are really not a good approach for understanding an individual's unique experiences and cannot simply be used as a substitute for individual interviewing. Moving on to the next method, which is case studies. The case study method, usually conducted on individuals in clinical psychology, can be applied to an organization, locality, or change process. Community psychologists can study an individual in relation to the settings in that person's life. They may conduct multiple case studies, so comparisons can be made. Case studies provide a bridge connecting qualitative and quantitative approaches. Archival data can also be quantitative. Records such as police statistics, records of attendance at programs, or quantitative evaluations of whether a program attained its goals. Case studies can also use other quantitative measures such as questionnaires. Moving on to the strengths and weaknesses of case study method. Like participant observation, a case study can examine in depth a single person, setting, or locality. Case studies are excellent for understanding the nuances of cultural, social, and community contexts. They can afford thick descriptions and contextual understanding. By using multiple data resources, subjective biases can be checked. The longitudinal focus of most case studies is also very useful. Although case study researchers cannot study causes and effects with experimental control, they can identify complex patterns of causation in natural settings. Their focus on a single case is also the principal limitation for case study method. Generalizability of findings to other settings is uncertain. Written records can provide information on meetings or other events not attended by the researcher and remembered imperfectly by interview informants. Archival records can also document events in the history of an organization or community. Moving on to the quantitative methods now. Research involving the collection of data in numerical form for quantitative analysis. The numerical data can be durations, scores, counts of incidents, ratings, or scales. Quantitative data can be collected in either controlled or naturalistic environments, in laboratories or field studies, from special populations or samples of the general population. The defining factors is that numbers result from the process. Whether the initial data collection produced numerical values or whether non-numerical values were subsequently converted to numbers as part of the analysis process, as in the content analysis. Quantitative methods are particularly useful in helping us to describe the model of multi-level influence of environmental factors on individual health and well-being. Let me tell you about the common features of all quantitative methods. A great diversity of quantitative methods exists. However, most quantitative methods in community research share some common features. Now these are: number 1, measurement and comparisons. The principal aim of quantitative methods is to analyze measurable differences between and the strengths of relationship amongst those variables. They facilitate understanding variables, predicting outcomes, and understanding causes and effects. Number 2, numbers are data. Although some variables are categorical, the purpose is almost always to study their relationship to measured variables. 3, cause and effect. One important objective is to understand the cause and effect relationships. This can lead to the prediction of consequences and inform social action to promote desirable changes. 4 is generalization. Another important objective is to derive conclusions that can be generalized, at least to some extent, across contexts, settings, and communities. Empirical findings showing that a prevention program or social policy is effective in many communities. And finally, standardized measures. Standardized measurement instruments are preferred to ensure reliable, valid measurement. The flexibility and contextual sensitivity of qualitative methods are lost, but the comparability of findings across studies and control of extraneous variables are increased. Now I'm going to discuss with you the 4 specific types of quantitative methods in community psychology. They are quantitative description, randomized field experiments, non-equivalent comparison group designs, and interrupted time series designs. Let's begin with the first one, which is the quantitative description. Quantitative description method includes a variety of procedures, example surveys, structured interviews, behavioral observations of community settings, epidemiological studies, and the use of social indicators. They are quantitative but not experimental, and they do not involve manipulation of an independent variable. They can be used for such purposes as follows. Number 1, to compare existing groups. Number 2, to study association between survey variables. Number 3, to measure characteristics of community settings. Number 4, to conduct epidemiological studies to identify factors predicting the presence or absence of an illness, and then to study relationship between geographic, spatial, and social environments. Statistical analysis may include correlation, multiple regression, path analysis, and structural modeling, and even t-tests or analysis of variance to compare naturally occurring groups. Correlation and causation. Early undergraduate education in psychology typically contrasts correlation and causation. Just because 2 factors are associated statistically does not mean that one causes the other one. The causation could just as easily run in the opposite direction than what you think. B causes A rather than A causing B, or the causal factor may be a third variable that determines both correlated variables, C causing both A and B. Community surveys. Surveys of community samples using standardized questionnaires or other measurements are quantitative descriptions methods. Community surveys can focus on organizations as units of analysis. Epidemiology. These methods are useful for community research concerned with health and mental health. Epidemiology is the study of the frequency and distribution of disorders and of risk and protective factors for these. 2 basic epidemiological concepts such as incidence and prevalence I have to explain to you. Incidence is the rate of new occurrences of a disorder in a population within a specific time period, usually a year. It is thus a measure of the frequency of the onset of a disorder. Prevalence is the rate of existing occurrences of a disorder in a population within a time period. It includes new cases and continuing cases of the disorder that began before the time period study. Both concepts are usually expressed as rates. Another very important factor is that of risk factors. Risk factors are associated with increased likelihood of a disorder. These may be causes of the disorder or simply correlated with it. Exposure to stressors or lack of coping resources are examples of risk factors. Now I have to tell you about protective factors also. Protective factors are associated with lesser likelihood of a disorder. They may counteract or buffer the effects of the disorder's causes or simply be correlated with other factors that do so. Personal or cultural strengths and support systems are protective factors. Mapping physical and social environment. The increased availability of geographical information system, which is called GIS methods, offer a rich new resource for studying relationships between physical spatial aspects of the communities and their psychosocial qualities. Moving on to the strengths and weaknesses. Quantitative description methods have a number of strengths. Standardized measurement affords statistical analysis and large samples that provide greater generalizability. These methods can be used to study variables that cannot be manipulated in an experiment. Epidemiological research can be used to identify risk and protective factors and evaluate the outcomes of preventive efforts. Finally, these studies often identify factors that can be targeted for social or community change even without the experimental knowledge of specific causes and effects. However, these methods have several limitations. They rely on prior knowledge to select and measure variables and populations. Also, except for GIS approaches, the knowledge provided by these studies is usually decontextualized, gathered from individuals but not associated with existing settings or communities or cultures. This can increase breadth of sampling but limits knowledge of these contextual factors. Next is the randomized field experiments. This is the most rigorous form of experimental social innovation. Participants, that is individuals or settings, are randomly assigned to experimental or control group. These are compared at a pre-test before the implementation of the experimental social innovation, at which time they are expected to be equal on measures of dependent variables. These are compared again on post-tests when they are expected to differ because of the effects of innovation. A third approach is to provide the experimental innovation to members of the control group after the post-test. They serve first as a control group and then they receive the innovation, minimizing ethical problems with their not receiving it originally. The strengths and weaknesses. Randomized field experiments are unsurpassed for clarity of cause and effect interpretation. With greater control over confounding factors, researchers can make more confident interpretations of its effects. Moreover, experimental studies demonstrate the effectiveness of a social innovation advocacy, for it can be more effective. However, there are certain limitations. A useful sequence might be to conduct qualitative studies to understand the context and key variables, then quantitative descriptions to specify risks and protective factors and refine measurements, then developing an experimental social innovation and conducting an experiment to evaluate its effectiveness. The next method is the non-equivalent comparison group design. For a variety of reasons, many settings simply cannot support random assignment to experimental and control conditions. Using a non-equivalent comparison group is a common approach. Non-equivalent comparison group designs are used whenever assignment to experimental or comparison condition is something other than random. The strengths and weaknesses. Using an existing group as a comparison condition is practical, less intrusive than randomized experiments. However, the control of confounding factors is much weaker, and the clarity of interpretation and confidence in conclusions is therefore decreased. Researchers in this situation must collect as much data as possible on factors that may confound the comparison. This allows them to document the similarity of the two conditions or to use those variables as statistical controls. The next method is the interrupted time series design. In the simplest case, this involves repeated measurement over time of a single case, which could be an individual, organization, locality, or another social unit. The strengths and weaknesses. Time series designs are practical. They also afford understanding of changes over time in a specific context, such as one of a community, while standardizing measurement and minimizing extraneous confounds. However, a time series design with one group is still open to a number of external confounds. These include seasonal or cyclical fluctuations in the variables measured. A further confound concerning historical events that affects the variables measured. Finally, findings from a single case or community, even over a long period of time, may not generalize to other communities. A key issue for time series designs is the number and timings of measurements in the baseline and experimental periods. Lastly, multiple baseline designs. This is a form of interrupted time series design that reduces the problem of external confounds and generalizability. Think of this design as a set of time series studies, each conducted in a different community and compared to each other. The experimental social innovation is implemented at a different time in each community. So effects of an external historical factor, which is happening at the same time for all the communities, such as a national publicity about tobacco use, will not be confounded with the innovation. Let me summarize. I have talked to you today about the qualitative and the quantitative methods. Qualitative methods are the methods which include focus groups, in-depth interviews and reviews of documents for types of themes. Whereas the quantitative methods have surveys, structured interviews, observation, reviews of records and documents and other numeric information. Qualitative methods have primarily inductive process used to formulate theory or hypothesis. In quantitative, primarily deductive processes used to test pre-specified concepts, constructs and hypotheses that make up a theory. In qualitative, more subjective methods are used. Describes a problem or conditions from the point of view of those experiencing it. So it is text based. Whereas the quantitative method is more objective. It provides observed effects, which is interpreted by the researcher of a program on a problem or condition, so it is number based. Qualitative is having more in-depth information and quantitative is less in-depth but more breadth of information across a number of cases. Qualitative is unstructured or semi-structured response option, whereas quantitative is fixed response option. Qualitative has no statistical tests, whereas quantitative statistical tests are used for analysis. In qualitative, it can be valid and reliable, largely depends on skill and rigor of the researcher, but in quantitative, it can be valid and reliable, largely depends on the measurement device or instrument use. Quantitative is time expenditure, lighter on planning end and heavier during the analysis phase, less generalizable. Whereas quantitative is time expenditure, heavier on the planning phase and lighter on the analysis phase. So it is more generalizable.